All right, I'm about ready to start the first turn. I did want to clear up a couple of omissions and errors that I had made in the previous video. The first one was, I think I said when I was discussing the combat results table, which is over here, that various combat modifiers include column shifts and die roll modifiers. And that's not strictly true. There aren't really any column shifts. There's a lot of combat modifiers that would change the die roll, but there's not really any column shifts. Horse and cavalry units can charge in combat, which increases their combat factor by 1.5 times. So that could, ultimately result in a shift of the odds when simplified to match the columns. But there's no actual column shifts to the left or right in combat. It's all die roll modifiers. The other thing I didn't mention, I don't think, was that the units in the game actually have 3 major factors. They have a combat value, they have a movement value, in most cases, which is 2 for foot units and 4 for cavalry units. They also have a morale factor, which is a small number to the right of the unit. And that's actually fairly widely used. It's used in forced marching, it's used when trying to recover from disruption, and it's also used for tribal units if they stray too far from their homeland. Remember, the homelands are these dark lines. Units of under 6 morale end up disrupted if they're more than 5 tracks away from their homeland. That's negated if they're stacked with a leader, but if for some reason they become separated from their leader and their morale is 6 or less, I can't remember if it's 6 or less than 6, I'll double check, but they can become disrupted. What's kind of interesting about that is that a disrupted unit that's not within its homeland can't move. This would apply to the tribal units. So you could almost end up, or you could end up basically stranding yourself if you move too far from your homeland and then something happens to the leader, whether he's eliminated in combat or you maybe voluntarily move him away for some reason. You could end up stranding your own guys, and they're basically stuck. Because even if you roll to undisrupt them, they would immediately become disrupted again if they're more than 5 tracks away from their homeland. So that's kind of a little odd thing. I don't imagine that it happens very often because leaders, while not exactly plentiful, they're in fairly decent supply. Okay, so that's just a couple of clarifying items. Now, before I think I was talking about not sure what to do with the Dekeangli and Ordovices. I had mentioned, I think, that one of the uses of these small tribal forces here would be to slow down Roman reinforcements that appear along this road here coming out of Wales. I took a look at the activation requirements for the tribes kind of around this general area, and there's really not much that these units can do to activate these western tribes. They mostly require either a demoralized legion or removal of Roman units from some of these stronger areas that these guys by themselves can't really accomplish. So what I decided to try to do, though, is combine the speed bump approach with actually maybe accomplishing something else and see if I can threaten these 2 Roman centers here, Meriolanum and Vericanium. Vericanium happens to be a tribal center, so it's currently under control of these Roman units. That's 4 cohorts, which is a pretty formidable force, 20 strength points, plus it gets a die roll modifier for having 4 cohorts together in a combat. So it may not be particularly feasible for this sort of rabble force to overcome that. I think together they've got around 35 or 40 strength points, but it's going to be pretty tough because even at 2-to-1 odds, with the potential die roll modifiers that the Romans get, it's dicey making that attack. And I'm not even sure that they would be able to get all of their units into, an attacking formation, you know, to all hit the tract at the same time. But we'll give it our best shot. The setup for them was 1 unit per low or high hills, and the leaders could be stacked with any unit, so they're kind of forced to be a little bit spread out. I think I might actually move. Yeah, that's a better unit there. Let's swap this 6 with the 3, and then we'll put this one. There we go. That's probably better. All right, so we'll give it a shot and see what we can manage to do there. I did happen to rustle up an old counter tray from another game, which doesn't really need it, so that's going to be significantly helpful when I have to bring out other tribes. I'll go ahead and make some moves and then come back. All right, I decided to throw caution to the wind a little bit here and make a first turn attack on Viraconium. The units here were able to make it without having to force march, but all of these guys here had to force march in order to get there, which basically means there's a chance that they'll end up disrupted. Now, the way that forced marching works is you roll 2 dice and you compare the unit's morale to the 2 dice. And if the 2 dice are below the unit's morale number, then the forced march succeeds. The good news is leaders can deduct their morale value from the units that they are traveling with to lower that number. So in this case, there are 2 leaders, the Ordovices leader and the Dekeangli leader. So these 2, the strongest 2 units that came over, will be able to have 4 and 3 reduce from their morale their roll respectively. Now in the case of this Ordovices unit, that means he's automatically going to succeed because his morale is 8, which I don't think you can see there, maybe you can barely see it. And the Ordovices leader's morale factor is 4. So even if I roll a 12, that's going to be, well actually technically they would be disrupted, so let's see what happens there. So we'll roll for that one. Yeah, I rolled a 3. So these guys are fine, they made it. So I'm going to adjust them and put them with this stack over here. Okay. Now, the next is going to be this Dekeangli unit here. His morale is 7. We'll subtract 3 from the die roll. I only rolled a 5, so he made it. So he's good. Now I've got this unit here, which is an 8. No modifier to the die roll. And I roll a 9. So that means he's not going to make it, and he becomes disrupted. So he will disrupt in the adjacent hex. That's not great. Now we'll do with this guy, who's a 7. And I rolled a 5, so he's okay. All right, so what we basically ended up with, and I'll have to stack these all together, but we ended up with a force pool of 14, 23, 27 versus whatever happens to be here in Viraconium, and there'll be a battle there. Combat is not mandatory in this, so I could just kind of camp out there and not actually fight, but where would be the fun in that? So we're going to be looking at a 1-to-1, set of combat odds here, which isn't all that great for the tribal player. But maybe this surprise attack will have something useful come out of it. So we'll set those there. Now, in addition to that, over here, Boudica sent her units in a couple of different places. One, to activate the Trinovantes, which is a pretty decent tribal faction, the rebels need to control Camelodunum, which is here. So they were able to march down 3 powerful units, totaling, 21 strength points, versus a town defender with 3 strength points. So that one's going to pretty much be a guaranteed, slaughter. Over here, some of the faster cavalry units have outpaced Boudica. She did a couple of forced marches with a couple of units to get a decent stack here in this town right here. And at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, she's really not yet within striking distance of Verulamium and Londinium, which are the 2 places that need to be conquered in order for the Catavellauni to come in, which is probably the largest, most powerful faction there is. However, these horse units should be able to take Verulamium on the next turn. and then they'll have to swing down with Boudica's troops and take Londinium. These guys up here we'll use to sort of hopefully garrison this northern sector, although frankly by the time the units get down here from Lindum, there should be plenty of Catavella Uni ready to go. The next set of tribes that will want to be activated are going to be these southern ones down here, which will be able to use the cavalry units or any other cavalry units that are spawned by the Catavella Uni or Trinovantes to send units down and activate these tribes down here. So we'll do, I guess, an attack over here, which is probably going to be the simplest one. And we'll go through all of the steps that it takes. The first thing you do is you compute the odds. So we've got basically 7-to-1 odds here. 20, what did I say, 21, right? 21 to 3. So the odds table maxes out at 6-to-1. So that's where we'll start. But then we add various modifiers. Now they actually happen to be listed here. The only modifier that really applies in this particular case is the tribal unreliability modifier. So what happens there is every time the tribal units are involved in combat, you roll one die and you compare it to the tribal unreliability table. So I'll go ahead and roll. I get a 3. A 3 happens to be, let's see, 1 to tribal disadvantage. So essentially, when we roll the dice for combat, we're going to lower the die roll by 1 point. Now, it depends on whether or not the tribe is attacking or defending, whether you would lower it or raise it. But in this particular case, since the tribal unit's attacking, low values on the die roll are bad for attackers, high values are bad for defenders. So we'll go ahead and roll. A 1, which will resolve to a 0. At 6-to-1, 25% of the strength points of the defender are to be eliminated, and 10% of the strength points of the attacker. It's not particularly good for us. It does eliminate the defending town defender here from Camelodunum, so that's good. He's gone. But we're going to have to eliminate 10% here, which basically means we're going to lose this cavalry unit. There is a rule that says the winner of a battle can ignore 10% losses, but only if one of two things are true. Either he's only got 1 counter in the battle, which doesn't apply here, or the combat value of all of his counters does not exceed 10, which also doesn't apply here. So in this case, we do have to adhere to that 10% loss. So we're going to take that 4-strength cavalry unit out. So even though we won, and even though our losses called for fewer percentage losses than the defender, we actually lost more strength points, 4 versus 3, than the defenders had. So what we'll do here is we'll stick this Iceni cavalry unit up here on the demoralization record, and that's 4 strength points. We're basically 10% of our way to becoming demoralized as a tribe. So that's not a particularly auspicious beginning to our battle, but hey, what the heck. So then when Roman Town Defender comes off, they do not apply for demoralization in any way. So we'll just set them aside. And now that we've conquered a Roman center, we have to determine looting. And fortunately, we have a table for that. So we're going to roll our die and compare it to the tribal looting table, which is way up here. I got a 1. We're looting for 1 game turn. So what we do here is we get a looting marker. It looks like this. And there we go. There's a 1 and a 2 on it. So we'll put the 1 side up to show that we're looting for 1 turn. And essentially what that means is on the next turn, we'll take it off and those guys will be able to move and continue. So right now they're looting, raping, burning, and pillaging in Camelodunum, and they're stuck there for 1 turn before they'll be able to move again. Next, we're going to actually go after this combat here, but I'm going to compute all of that stuff off the video, and then we'll go with the results. All right, one thing I did just realize, I forgot that I got to use the surprise or ambush, because this is the first turn following a tribal activation that does apply to the Iceni on turn 1. However, in looking at the CRT, I'd still have been called upon excuse me, to lose 10%, so it wouldn't have changed the result of what we had to do. Now over here, what I ended up calculating was 27 attacking strength points versus 21 defending strength points. So that, ends up being a 1-to-1, odds on the table. Then doing the die roll modifiers, the Ordovices leader was able to add 1 for his combat value. The Dekiangli leader was also a 1, so you just apply 1 leader's combat ability to that. So I applied that. There are 4 cohorts in this stack here for Rome, so they get a 1 modifier for Roman discipline for legionnaires. So that would subtract 1 from the resulting die roll. But I happen to roll a 6 for tribal unreliability, which is a +2 on the tribal player's advantage. So he's going to add 2 to his die roll for the tribal player being, I guess, whipped into a frenzy. So the final die modifier in this particular example is a +2. There are no surprise or ambush rolls for the Dekiangli or Ordovices on the first turn, I guess because they weren't considered pacified at the time. So we'll go ahead and roll on our CRT on our 1-to-1 column. I got a 5 plus 2 is 7. So for a 7, the attacker loses 10% and the defender has to lose 50%. So that means on 21, the defender has to lose at least, 11. So I don't think it makes much difference. All 4 of these cohorts are the same. So we'll just lose 2 of them, and we'll lose the town defender to get us to 11. And that was, the town defender doesn't count for demoralization, but the cohorts do for the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix. So that's 10 strength points toward 45 strength points of demoralization. So they're almost a quarter of the way there. The tribal player does have to lose 10% of his, 27 or something like that. So that'll be, the smallest guy he's got is a 3. So we'll take out that 3 and put them with the Ordovices, who have a 14 strength point demoralization level. So they're, a little bit less than a quarter of the way there. Now, the Roman player immediately has to retreat 2 tracks because he's the loser of the combat for having lost the higher percentage of losses. So these 2 guys are going to retreat. I guess in theory I could retreat up to Mediolanum, where there is a auxiliary Roman unit there that's a 5. The other option would be retreat toward Penno Crucium and maybe sync up with a couple of these one-off units sitting over here. Probably the best thing to do is to keep safety in numbers, although really the tribal player is probably going to be hitting Mediolanum next. And having a 15 there probably isn't going to help us much because the tribal player will be able to get about 30, definitely be able to get 30 strength points there to go to 2-to-1. 2-to-1 odds with probably no die roll modifier on average is going to be, it's a pretty much better chance of having the defender lose more. It's tough to say. I don't know if it's better to preserve force at this point or if it's better to kind of offer battle. The other thing I could do, though, is I've got at least 1 unit within movement points of Mediolanum. So I could actually end up with 19 strength points and a cavalry unit, which actually was going to give me another modifier. So I think I am going to retreat up the road to from Virocanium to Mediolanum. Nobody entered the battle through this track's side, so I think that's okay for me to do. Now, since this is a tribal center, the tribal player does not have to. Oh, yes, he does. This is Virocanium. The tribal player does have to decide if he's loot or determine how long he's going to loot for. So we'll go ahead and roll. We got a 6. That's 2 game turns. So we take a looting marker, and basically all of the tribal units in this hex are going to be busily spending 2 turns looting. Now, there is an advance after combat requirement for tribal players when they are victorious. So normally the tribal player would be required to follow the retreating Roman player by 1 hex. However, since the looting happened, he is not required to do that. In fact, can't do it. So he has to stay in the hex looting. So we'll do that, and that does give the Roman player a bit of a reprieve because those guys are going to be 2 turns spent looting Viraconium. That is it for the tribal player's turn, and it will now be the Roman player's turn. All right, I think I'm done moving here. Basically what happened, oh, I did forget this guy, and he's kind of exposed. We're going to move him back up to join his friends. Basically, I moved down the 9th Legion toward the action. Had to leave a couple of cohorts behind because these, you can't leave Danum or Lindum ungarrisoned or else the Brigantes come in. Now, the Brigantes are interesting because they have both a pro and an anti-Roman faction. So in theory, I haven't looked actually to see which faction is stronger. I'm guessing it's the anti-Roman faction, although I don't know for sure. I should probably double check that before I decide to leave garrisons up there. Over here, what we did was we consolidated those cohorts from the battle at Viraconium, retreated north, and I moved in a couple of units from the outlying areas to create a larger stack. One of them got disrupted on his forced march, but made it, so he was okay there. Down here, I've begun to move the 2nd Augusta eastward along this trail from Glavum. They could move 1, 2, 3 spaces without having to worry about forced marching, which I'm not going to bother to do yet. Basically, an attempt to get into the Catavello Uni homeland and start fighting. The one thing I got to be a little bit cautious about, though, is, again, if Glavum or Viraconium or Araconium are left open, that's going to bring in the Dimetae and the Silures. So I need to make sure I keep legionary units, so cohorts there. One of the things that the tribal player might decide to do is it might not be worth fighting this reconstituted Roman force here. He might, after his looting period is over, come down here to menace this area. Because if he can conquer one of these 2 spaces, that's going to help him a lot with bringing in 2 more Highland tribes. So that will probably necessitate the 2nd Augusta sending some units back. The other thing is there are reinforcements coming in which could chase the tribal player. They're coming in up here and could come down behind him and possibly hope to catch him before he's able to conquer one of these 2 spots. So that's an option at some point. I also decided that I'm going to try some ship movement, which I haven't really done much before. I moved a unit that was over here to get ready to embark on the next turn, and I thought maybe I would try some ship movement with this flotilla here, bring it around the southern tip of England, and maybe even pick up some units off the coast here and bring them back around so they don't have to traverse the entire map, but can come in more toward the south. So the basic way that ship movement works is every time you enter a sea zone, you roll 2 dice and consult the, which one is it here? The sea movement table. So here we go. I rolled a 3, which means the flotilla is delayed. And the flotilla has to end its turn. So basically he got to move one space and he got delayed. There's no limit to the number of spaces you can move as a flotilla. You just have to roll for every sea zone you enter. And if you ever get a 2, he's sunk. Or if you ever get a, 3 or 4, he's delayed. And then 5 to 12 is successful. So not a very auspicious beginning to our fleet. But eventually maybe they'll make it around and be somewhat useful. So that's going to do it for the first turn of this game. Pretty successful in that we got to see combat, we got to see some modifiers, we got to see looting, and I don't think anybody is overstacked. No, not even close anywhere, so that's okay. We would do the demoralization check phase at this point, but nobody's that close to being demoralized. So we'll begin turn 2. And on turn 2, you got Paulinus coming in at OR1. So he's going to enter with, basically, it's the governor, his guard, and a bunch of other cavalry units. In fact, all cavalry units. So they've got a fast movement rate of 4. The governor and his guard actually have a movement rate of 5. So they ought to be able to catch the tribal player. I'll put those right up there. And get ready, and we'll move to the tribal player. They're going to be able to catch this stack, I think, before it can get down here, because even if they force march, you've got 1, 2, 3 to 4, 1, 2, 3. Well, 2 turns. Maybe they can't. They may have to force march, though, which could end up causing some, disruption and guys being left kind of behind. But they're going to have to move pretty quickly to be able to get to Viracanium, or Aracanium, I should say, and try to menace it to keep the Second Augusta sort of in the neighborhood and not allow them the ability to join up maybe with the 9th Hispania and tee off on the tribes over here. So we'll see what happens. What is going to happen for sure at this point in turn 2 when we check for activation is we are going to get another tribe, the Trinovantes, active. So we'll see what that means when we bring them in.